Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Jim Shepard to discuss his new novel, Phase 6, published by our friends at Alfred A. Knopf. Jim Shepard is the author of 7 previous novels, most recently, The Book of Aaron, winner of the 2016 PEN New England Award, and a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, among many other honors, and 5 story collections, including Like You'd Understand Anyway, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and won the Story Prize. His short fiction has appeared in, among other magazines, The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, McSweeney's, The Paris Review, The Atlantic, Esquire, Tin House, Granta, Zoetrope, Electric Literature, and Vice, and has often been selected for the Best American Short Stories and the PEN O. Henry Prize Stories. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Margot Livesey. Margot grew up in a boys' private school in the Scottish Highlands where her father taught and her mother was the school nurse. After taking a BA in English and philosophy at the University of York in England, she spent most of her 20s working in shops and restaurants and learning to write. Her first book, a collection of stories called Learning by Heart, was published in 1986. Since then, Margot has published 8 novels, including Homework, Criminals, The Missing World, and her most recent, The Boy in the Field, among others. Margot is currently teaching at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Phase 6 from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Ooh, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Books and Books, for your hospitality. It's very nice to be virtually in Miami.
Okay. So here is what is going on. One of you has a window or an application that's open, that's interfering with the sound. So if you could close out of any open tabs on your computer, we should be fine. That's the reverberation that happens sometimes when there's something else open. Okay, let's try it again. Hang on, I just toggled off your... Let's try it. Uh-oh, something is still happening.
Okay.
Oops. I don't know on whose side it is.
Okay.
Are you both closed out of any open tabs on your computer? Nope, it's still happening. Yep.
What is...
Margot, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think I turned off my computer before we did this, and then to close everything, so...
Okay. What about you, Jim? Yeah, I think it's happening on your side. Yep.
Okay, let's see what else
Maybe just close out of email, just any open tabs. I can always re-prompt you in. So sorry about this. Hello?
Hello?
Yep. Still happening. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Okay. Jim, do you happen to have headphones?
I do.
Let's try
How's
that.
that?
A million times better. Margot? Can you hear him?
I can hear. Could you say something, Jim?
I could say something, yes.
Yeah, I can hear him.
Hallelujah. Sorry about that, but okay. So, without further ado, here they are, and we can hear them. All right, I'll leave you to it.
Well, that was easy.
Yeah, in some ways that was wonderfully appropriate. I mean, as a kind of welcome. Before we begin, I just have to tell you that on the front page of The Guardian today, there's an article about this tiny worm that has survived for 24 million years in the permafrost. And the main thing people seem to complain about is that it survived without having sex. And all the worms are female. Somehow I thought, oh, this is paving the way for phase 6.
That does feel like that, doesn't it?
It would be wonderful if you would read to us, Jim, to begin our conversation.
I think I can do that. I will read you a little bit from the beginning. This is a section early on after some miners have been infected by the outbreak's index patients. On the morning all the sled dogs spent howling, the foreman for Blue Jay Mining's Rare Earths Elements Disco Bay 2 mine, Kristen Lena, and 5 of his crew were the last ones aboard an Air Greenland flight that after 2 stops dropped them exhausted at Keflavik International Airport in Reykjavik. They were each becoming histological messes. They had completed the verification drilling on schedule and had weathered their double shifts with the union's blessing and had earned their paychecks and their 2 weeks home. It wasn't clear yet whether the higher-ups were going to settle on ion exchange or multi-stage solvent extraction or what. But there'd be multiple steps in the separation process, and that wasn't their worry anyway, being a concern above their pay grade, though it sounded like they would be doing some of that work on site in order to save transportation costs on so many tons of permafrost. Christian was so overheated that he was sweating on the plane, especially before they got moving, and his air nozzle above his seat didn't seem to be working at all. And when he wiped himself down with the little napkins the stewardesses handed out, he apologized to the old lady sitting next to him. She seemed unwilling to accept his apology. He tried to read, but he was having trouble concentrating, and his breath smelled unpleasant and odd, even with the throat lozenges on which he'd been binging. In Reykjavik, their group stuck together for a little while before heading to their various gates. And at a pop-up hair product store, Global Grooming, he bought some texturing wax while his buddies teased him about his relentlessness with the hair gel. The one he ended up with smelled mintier than he would have preferred and was expensive besides, but he bought it anyway. He tried 7 different samples before he made his choice and dropped each back into its rack. His friend Tom told him that this was the worst headache he had ever had, and Yussi kept coughing like a seal and wiping his face and dropping his handkerchief, grossing everyone out. They went into Elko and horsed around hanging wireless beats on each other's ears, and then settled on sandwiches and sushi at Malthus, appreciating the no-fuss self-service after having handled and rejected packaged pastas and curries and salads and 2 different cold soups. Yussi's connection was first to Copenhagen, and Tom was off to London, and Willy to Frankfurt. Willem was staying in town overnight to meet some friends and then heading to Brussels. And Douglas was also going to London and from there to Bath. All 6, as they dawdled from one end of Keflavik Airport to the other, generated, with their sneezing and coughing and throat clearing, particle mists so fine that the microbe-laden aerosols could sail many hundreds of meters on the tiny air currents generated by the airport's air conditioning system until they settled and stuck. And then they hitched rides on the next hands to come along and encounter those surfaces as part of a microbial passenger list so teeming that the bacteria along for those rides outnumbered in each individual their total sum of human cells. I'll stop there, and things, as you might guess, go downhill from there. I'm still getting an echo. I'm going to try it without the headphones and see what happens. Is that I'll just have to deal with my own echo, that's all. How's that?
Much better. But the only thing I could do, Jim, is I could close out your video and invite you back in again. And we could wait here for you and see if when you come back on, you don't have that echo, because if you come back on with your headphones, you should be fine. So let me know. Try that? Yeah, let's try that. Okay. All right. Let me come back out so I don't leave Margot there by herself. Okay. I'm going to do that now. Wow. The joys of technology. Okay. Pumping back in.
How's that? Go
ahead. Better?
I still have a little echo, but I'll live with it.
Okay.
Do you echo or I echo or both of us?
Well, it's mostly me echoing. So it's the worst of both possible worlds. I have to hear myself twice, essentially.
Thank you for that wonderful, chilling reading, which makes it so abundantly clear how microbes travel around the world. I was thinking as you were reading about the contrast between Christian and the mine workers, who are so cosmopolitan, so much a part of the larger world, and Alec and Malik, I'm not sure if I'm saying either of their names correctly, the two boys in the tiny settlement of 80 people on the coast of Greenland who begin the novel, and Alec remains really at the heart of the novel in so many ways.
There is a really huge difference, it seems to me, between those two constituencies. When I conceived of the book, I imagined a kind of a worm's eye view in which, what would it be like to be that index patient, to be the person who not only is the very beginning of a pandemic like this, but is also able to imagine all of that responsibility without any knowledge of how it's all happening. I think one of the things that interests me so much about kids in that position is the way, we all, when we're children, and, having raised Catholic, this was a big part of it for me, I'm sure. The way we're all as children traumatized by events, or especially the disappearance of loved ones, and the way we can feel responsible for that and internalize the shame of that, and the way that propensity for magical thinking makes you feel like, of course, everything could have been your fault, right? Especially if you come from a place where you don't have much information. So I wanted to put that up against the kind of cosmopolitan figures like Christian, who are coming in from the outside as part of this extractive capitalism and just pulling stuff out, right? And so when those two worlds mix, you have both an emotional collision and a scientific collision of a sort, right? Scientific's not exactly the right word, but
yeah. And Alec is someone who seldom acts in his own best interests and is almost never happier than when he's doing something that at least several people disapprove of, I would say.
Yes, and that might sum up a lot of my young protagonists, people who are never acting in their best interests and are always interested in doing something like that, right? And that adds to that sense of complicity, which I find so heartbreaking, right? I mean, on the one hand, there's the adult's complicity in what's going on,
right?
But there's also that child's sense of, if only I hadn't climbed onto that place I wasn't supposed to climb onto, maybe none of this would have happened. And I spent most of my childhood feeling that way at one point or another. And when I didn't feel that way, my mother pointed out that I should feel that way most of the time.
Yeah. If only Alec hadn't got interested in that particular shiny rock with the goose bacteria in it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I was wondering if maybe for people who haven't yet had the good fortune to read the novel, you could explain the two meanings of phase 6.
Okay. Being an interesting title, it actually has multiple meanings, as you point out. The obvious meaning is the World Health Organization's highest level of alert. The evidence that the WHO has that things have gotten about as bad as they can get is phase 6. They go from phase 1 to phase 6. And in the case of the protagonist, one of the protagonists in the novel, one of the epidemiologists, she's thinking back on a disastrous relationship that she wished hadn't been disastrous. And she remembers a moment when they were at their happiest or close to their happiest. And for some reason, thinking she would be funny, she decided she would walk her new lover through the phases of relationships as she understands them. And phase 6 is the one where you get to where you say something like, it's not you, it's me. And he takes umbrage at it, given that they're in a very early happy stage and she's bringing this up. And so she has that sense, like Alec, that she could screw up just about anything. My father used to say, my father had a wonderfully salty way of putting things. And he used to say about me that I could screw up a wet dream, essentially.
What a great line. Things that no one has ever said to me.
That's because you come from good stock, Margot.
Yeah. A number of the reviews I read of phase 6, one of the things that interested me was that they praised your prescience in writing a pandemic novel before we actually had a pandemic. But for me, one of the things that seemed to be clear reading the novel is that you weren't being particularly prescient, that there are actually thousands and thousands of well-educated people who saw this coming.
Yes, like any number of things that descend on the world, a lot of intelligent and hardworking people see it coming. Not enough of the people in power take advantage of that, however. But there's a reference in the novel to a gathering of epidemiologists in 2006, an international gathering, in which they all came forward and said, there's going to be a major pandemic in the next 1 or 2 generations. They're pretty certain of that, they thought. So yeah, this was no great amazing Kreskin moment on my part. I was simply reacting to what I was reading and learning, essentially.
And the references to COVID were really ones that you put in maybe after finishing the manuscript.
Yeah, I delivered the book in May of 2020. And thank God I had sold it in advance. It was the only book I've ever sold in advance. And Knopf, my lovely publisher, was like, oh, what do we do with this? And there was a big debate, do we bring it out right away or do we bring it out a year from now? And everyone seemed to agree that there's probably no good time to bring out a novel about a pandemic after or during or even right before a pandemic. So the decision was made essentially to wait as long as we did. Once we did that, then it became, well, we have to take COVID into account. Yeah. And the other thing that allowed was a process of editing whereby all of that exposition that, I felt like I needed to educate the reader about what is a pandemic like. Yeah. Much of that began to fall away because the public was given a forced education in what pandemics were like. So I could start to strip away the more commonplace stuff. And a book that was all pretty thin to begin with began to get thinner, essentially. I mean, as you know, I like sort of lean and mean books, and this book got leaner. I don't know if it got meaner, but it got leaner.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was an amazing, amazingly I was going to say a coincidence, but it wasn't a coincidence. It was amazingly serendipitous, your timing. I read an interview with Jane Smiley a few months ago, and one of the things she claims is that for her, each book opens the door for the next, that the next book is always in a kind of writing back, if you will, to the book before, doing things she couldn't do in the book before. So then I was thinking about your most recent book, The World to Come, which is in superficial ways so different from Phase 6. Do you recognize Smiley's remark? Does it make sense to you?
I do, and I wonder if Jane's remark bears more on novels in sequence than, say, the relationship of a collection of stories to a novel. Because the previous novel to this, of mine, The Book of Aaron, has a boy in extremis that's very much like this boy. And like the boy in the previous novel, I'm very interested in the pathos of a child standing in the path of a force like this, essentially. There's a great phrase that I came across years ago, something like, when history is let off the leash. And I've always been interested in the sadness of the very young people in the path of something like that, essentially. And so in that way, I'm always relating one to the other. I'm always coming back to that sort of model.
Yeah. And in the case of Phase 6, I mean, it isn't only a pandemic novel, pandemic story. It's also in many ways a love story. I mean, Janine and Denise, the two, one's an epidemiologist and one is a kind of wonk. I mean, they're both in love with science, and they also fall into a kind of platonic love with each other. I mean, they feel like they've met kindred spirits when they're sent off on this preposterous trip to Greenland together. And as someone who grew up wanting to be Marie Curie, I was really thrilled to see women being taken so seriously and working so hard in science.
Yeah, I loved the idea when I conceived of the multiple points of view of having both of the scientists that the CDC sent out be women. Because one of the problems the CDC always faces is their emissaries are not always treated with as much respect and given as much authority as they need. And a number have talked about the fact that that's even more of a problem when there's a woman along. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, what if there were two women? What if there were only women? And when you have that sort of ramifying alongside the scientific detective story, how are we going to get to the bottom of this? And it's very important we do get to the bottom of this. You suddenly have these women in this astonishingly pressurized situation. And on top of that, I was imagining women who both would say a version of what the boy Alec would say, which is, I tend to alienate everybody. I don't know how I do it. And somehow I've ended up this lonely lab wonk. And here's this other person who seems to understand. So part of what leavens the oncoming darkness of the pandemic is the warmth that the individuals are generating between each other, I think. Even as they feel they're not very good at doing that kind of thing. We see them do it,
No, it's a very touching, very hard-edged relationship. Did you ever want to be Marie Curie?
I wanted to be various kinds of scientists, and thank God my scores made clear to me that was not a good idea at all. probably my first ambition was to be a veterinarian. And I imagined that I would discover the solution to dog immortality, and dogs would live forever, essentially. And once it became clear to me that, in fact, veterinarians had to put dogs down every so often, then that ambition went by the wayside. And I was always interested in science, like physics, but I would have been the world's worst physicist. So thank God I steered into another area where I could be mediocre instead of terrible.
I think you should maybe go back to the dog immortality thing. I don't think it's too late.
It's something a lot of people can get behind, I think, dog immortality.
Yeah. When I tried to think of literary ancestors to Phase 6, I mean, for me, the obvious one was a Journal of the Plague Year, which I realized when I reread it is actually a historical novel. Defoe was only about 5 when the plague of London took place, and he's looking back and reconstructing it.
Yes.
Whereas you're looking forward, but some of his techniques seemed amazingly modern.
Yes, and in fact, he was a great inspiration for the lightness of the mobility of the point of view, that ability to set down on someone and penetrate their sensibility very intimately, and then leave them, and leave them behind. And we might not ever know what happened to them. That was quite inspirational to me, because I knew I didn't want to do a big fat book, but I also knew that I had a lot of space to cover. Yeah. It also occurred to me after I wrote the book that another antecedent that I hadn't fully registered but was clearly a powerful influence was Michael Crichton's novel, The Andromeda Strain, which began with, I read it as a very young boy, and it began with an entire town being wiped out by a mysterious pathogen. And that's how this book begins as well. But I just thought, what an amazing and terrifying premise to realize that almost everybody has been struck down, and you don't know with what,
Yeah. I never read The Andromeda Strain. I will put it on my list. What was I going to ask you? If you're listening, please think about asking Jim questions. Other people besides me should be allowed to ask him questions. For the writers among your readers, could you say a little bit about how you wrote the novel? Did you, for instance, write a complete draft and then go and do research? Did research, which you're fabulous at, go hand in glove with the writing? Do you know?
In terms of the way research works, I have to do a huge amount of research before I can even begin writing, especially with subjects that I tend to be pretty ignorant about. So although I had been reading a lot about permafrost and the pathogens that might be in there before I began the novel, once I realized I was going to be writing this novel, I thought, okay, well, you're going to need to learn more about epidemiology. You're going to learn more about CDC, and you're going to have to learn more about emergency medicine. And those I was ignorant enough about that I had to do research before I could even begin writing. But once I begin writing, and I usually begin well before I think I have those subjects in hand, because if you wait, you'll never, if you say I have to wait until I know everything there is to know about epidemiology, you're never going to start writing. And writers, as you know, are geniuses at procrastination. So if we can put something off, we will put something off. So I start writing, and I also discover thereby what else I need to know, essentially. So I might say, I'm going to talk about this aspect of Greenland's infrastructure, and then suddenly go, I don't know that. I don't know what that is. Now I need to figure that out. So the research continues during the writing, during the revision, and even after the revision, because I'm always learning something that reorients me in some important way.
And some of the details just feel very much like lived experience, like the various dogs in the settlement, for instance, or Alec's grandfather. His rule is that he needs to be comfortable at home, so he's wearing his underwear at a funeral. I mean, a wake, I think. And, I mean, those details feel so much like lived experience.
In this case, I felt that I needed to go to Greenland because I felt like the place was alien enough to me that I wasn't going to get enough out of the usual sources. Yeah. And I thank God that I did, because there were all sorts of bizarrenesses about Greenland, really striking aspects of Greenland that don't show up in the research. One that I've mentioned to other people in interviews is all of the infrastructure has to be above ground because most of the houses are built on solid rock. And so everywhere you go, you're stepping over pipes that are carrying sewage or carrying rainwater or carrying drinking water or whatever. And it's like this spaghetti tangle that is go everywhere. Or a detail that hadn't shown up anywhere until I got to a settlement was all of these dogs living in crates that were set on their side out in the middle of these sort of little grassy meadows. These are the sled dogs. And they just look like little sentinels, like, you know, like the beefeater guards at you know, Buckingham Palace, except it's a dog out there near a tree, right? And it's visually a really striking image, but it doesn't, you know, you read about sled dogs when you read about Greenland, but you don't read where they sleep, right? So it's stuff like that.
And one of Alec's last things that we hear about him doing in the village, in fact, is going around feeding the dogs, isn't it? Dragging food out of the abandoned houses and leaving it for the dogs. So
yeah, almost all of the dogs are chained up. And it occurred to me that in a situation where everyone was sick, there'd be this enormous pathos that a child would recognize, that all of these dogs are in danger of starving, right? So in the novel, the boy finds a big bag of dog food and starts dragging it from dog to, you know, to keep them alive, keep them fed, essentially.
Yeah. And all of that is just the most amazing contrast with what happens to Alec when he comes to America and is suddenly being kept in an immensely sterile environment that everyone is afraid to enter.
Yeah, when I talked to people in the CDC, I was saying, so am I right in saying that a boy like this, who was very likely not only an index patient, but also a carrier, would be taken to a BSL-4 unit, which is the highest security kind of bio situation? And they were saying, yeah, that's essentially what would happen. And the one that I had taken to is a real one in Montana that has essentially living quarters for people who have been infected with these things and can be studied that way. And that's where my hero goes. That's where Alec goes, and he's stuck in this facility essentially.
Yeah. No, when you picture that against, for instance, the description, particularly of his friend Malik's house, which is unusually crowded with the grandparents the parents sleeping in the living room and the baby on the floor, right, and beds and
you know, not only the sterility and the emptiness of it, but for a boy like that, the fact that you don't have any touch, right? That everything has to be through these suits and everything is remote essentially. Seemed to me like a lovely metaphor of a sort. And the poor epidemiologist who says, I can't get through to human beings, now is in a suit where she has to try and do it, you know.
Yeah. Maybe before we open up to questions, you might read us your love song to microbes from page 19 of your novel.
Yes, I have just enough narcissism to be willing to read twice from my own book. This is a little section called Because Microbes Run the World. And the novel's divided into lots of little sections. This goes like this. What health professionals label as pathogens are just microbes exploiting a new resource, but otherwise doing what they've been doing for 3 billion years, feeding, growing, and spreading. Under optimal conditions, they can double their numbers every half hour. They don't die until something kills them, and they thrive everywhere and have been brought up alive from the bottom of the Marianas Trench, from beneath ice a mile thick in Antarctica, and from strata 140 million years old in a drill core 2 miles deep. Left to their own devices, most reside unnoticed in biological balance with their ecosystems. But what location on Earth remains left to its own devices? In an estuary, Vibrio cholerae is a blandly productive member of its community, but scooped up into the body in a drink of water, it can empty a human being of 30 liters of fluid a day.
Of course, Janine and Denise both want to be, is it Snow, the person who,
yes.
Who discovers that you take the handle off a pump and thereby stop a cholera epidemic?
And that's a wonderful story for epidemiologists because it reminds them how much of it is just legwork. It's just being willing to do all of the drudgery to figure out. We've plotted all of these cases and we've started to figure out a pattern, right? And that ability to just throw yourself into that kind of work is so important, and it doesn't lend to your self-esteem very much.
No, and at various points, both Janine and Denise rail against the fact, all these terrible things are happening, and their computers trying to map things and hold of the data and make connections. And
exactly.
It doesn't feel like the most useful thing to be doing.
And there's a beagle talking up. And it feels as though, not only is it pressurized, but it feels as though you might be making a really basic mistake. I mean, one of the things that really struck me is when I was talking to people in the field was how much fear they felt that at times when they were pursuing something like this, that they just missed something simple. Mm-hmm. And that they were just, if I'd only thought of that kind of thing, right?
I'm just going to look and see if there are questions. And I'm going to, there's a question from Julie Heim.
Oh, hi, Julie.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Margot. Jim, can you tell us about what triggered your obsession to follow these issues? You write a number of stories about disaster. What set you on this path, and what aspects of your characters drew you in?
What set me on this path? In this case, it was the story of the boy in Siberia, the 12-year-old who died maybe 5 years ago of anthrax. And he had, it turned out, contracted it from a reindeer carcass that had been buried in the permafrost. And I had already been obsessing about the exposure of the permafrost, the active layer growing and growing and growing. And the idea that these pathogens could be waiting there for us was something that had occurred to me before, and now it seemed confirmed, especially once I realized that they were going to be mining, that Russia and Greenland were going to be mining all across their upper extremities. And the second part of Julie's question is about the human beings involved in this. And again, going back to one of my obsessions that we touched on at the beginning, Margot, the sense of having sinned and brought something gigantic down on everybody. As having been raised Catholic, I was raised with that notion that our actions matter and that our actions can impact huge swatches of human beings. And that has always haunted me. And that's always something that I've come back to as a way of getting at, again, our complicity in all sorts of bad decisions that we make as a collective.
I would also add that Scottish Protestants can also generate guilt in young people. You don't, as a Catholic, have a monopoly on this.
I thought you might get cranky about that, Margot.
Finally, I have to stick up for my tribe. Another question. There are so many connections between science and art. Most scientists I know are also artists of a kind. What are your thoughts on those connections? Is literary fiction an exploration of science of a kind?
Oh, that's interesting. In terms of the first question, a lot of the way in which associative thinking works in terms of building hypotheses reminds me of creative thinking, right? You're sort of going, this follows from that, but what about if we jump that way in terms of our thinking? And in that regard, that part of the brain is very similar to the creative part of the brain, I think. Well, the other part of the question was about science and literature. Is that right?
Is literary fiction an exploration of science of a kind?
I think what literary fiction can do is dramatize the way in which the give and take in science can build a hypothesis. You provide A, I provide B, somebody else provides C, and we put that together. That's in a way, that's building a narrative, right? Mm-hmm. And so the challenge for somebody like me is to, first of all, understand it well enough that I can even begin to tell it, but then to put it in such a way that it makes dramatic sense, that it's dramatically pleasing, and that it isn't absolutely bogged down with the science itself. And in this case, I had help from a really, really smart microbiologist who teaches at Williams with me. And one of the things I was able to do was sit down with her and do exactly that kind of bounce ideas off each other stuff that I was then able to dramatize, where you sort of go, but suppose it's this. If it's this, then couldn't it be that? And she would go, no, you're not even thinking of, and that. And so I would just get rid of all of the really stupid things that I would come up with. And I would have two sides of a debate where both people were a little more informed, and that allows you to sort of model how science works without really it's not really science exactly, but it passed the smell test, right? What I want is something that when a microbiologist reads it or an epidemiologist reads it, they go, yeah, that's possible. That could happen. As opposed to just giving a short barking laugh and throwing the book across the room, or something like that.
What was the last book you threw across the room?
Oh, I've thrown books that I thought were badly researched across the room and discussed, where I thought, come on, I don't know that much about this, but I know this is wrong, right? Yeah. And that feels like a lack of respect in some ways for the world that's being created. I understand that willingness to want to change things, right? Mm-hmm. And to say, but when you claim that something that we know exists operates this way and we know it doesn't, then I'm like, okay, that's goofy. You should have done a little more work,
Yeah. I was trying to think as I read Phase 6 for the third time. These readings are spaced over one a month. I feel is about right.
Right.
But I tried to think why I loved being in this world so much, and because it's a harsh world in many ways, and one filled with doom and difficulty. But I think it's because your characters are always living their lives, even when they're dying. Alec's grandparents, for instance, remain very much themselves. The grandmother putting on her magic red shawl that will keep illness away, and the grandfather thinking about having another of those small beers that he likes because he can drink them before they get warm. And I think the great pleasure of Phase 6 is that the novel is simultaneously intimate and epic is not quite the right word, but on a much larger scale. And
yeah. And I think the movement between those two scales is rapid enough and fluid enough that you don't feel trapped in either one necessarily. That may help as well. But I'm glad it felt that way to you. That was certainly the way it was supposed to be designed. And that sense you have with characters sometimes that they've stopped acting because it's now time for them to die, as far as the book is concerned. That's not the way we tend to live our lives, right? We tend to imagine we're going to go on forever and that we still have our agendas. And so those people who are populating my narratives, at least, are continuing on until they run out of time. And they don't know what I know. They don't know they're about to run out of time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just as well that they don't know what. In one of your interviews, you talked about having seen a lot of films as a young person. That growing up in New York State, that you had access to lots of films. Did you also grow up in a house of books? Did your father, who said you could wreck a wet dream, was he reading? Was your mother reading?
I was the first in my family to go to college, and my parents were determined that I would go. They weren't quite sure how that was going to work besides getting good grades, and they weren't quite sure how to get good grades besides doing what the teachers told you. So one of the things they thought they should do is fill the house with books. That was the good news. The bad news was they thought, well, if you're going to read books, you should learn something. So there was no literature. It was all nonfiction. And it would seem to me that if you had a boy growing up reading just nonfiction and watching a lot of movies, he might well write the kind of fiction that I write, because my fiction, as you know, is not very ruminative. It doesn't sound like Henry James most of the time. It doesn't spend long stretches inside sensibilities as they self-diagnose. It tends to imagine that the project of fiction is trying to figure out how people work by watching them behave from the outside. And it's very cinematic in terms of always wanting to keep moving and always wanting to be visually interesting. So I think what my parents bequeathed me is now coming out on the page very much. And again, I came from a generation where we used TV and movies freely as babysitters. So I would get plopped in front of the TV and told not to move until the adults came back.
Another question. Would you both share with us what your last year during the pandemic has been? Have you written, read? What have you read, felt, experienced?
Wow, big question. Immediately upon delivering the novel to Knopf, I began a long story about the 1935 Labor Day hurricane, speaking of disasters, which was one of the most catastrophic to hit the United States. It sort of tore through the Keys, and it killed maybe somewhere between 400 and 600 veterans who had been trapped on the Keys. And that seemed to me a really important story about class in America and the way we treat our veterans. And so I wrote a story about that was quite long, and that's going to come out with Audible, believe it or not. So you'll be able to listen to it while you jog. Having finished that, I then did a long story about Adolf Eichmann, of all people. Again, as you can see, I tend to come up with subjects that make my agent despair. And those two stories have taken up a large part of the time since Knopf. They delivered the novel to Knopf. Reading, everybody seemed to think at first that we were in this strange limbo state, and everybody was reporting difficulties concentrating with reading. I discovered, I don't know about you, Margot, but I discovered that one of the best ways into reading when the pandemic had first hit was rereading books I loved. And that I did a for maybe 3 or 4 months. I was also teaching, of course, so I had to read all of that stuff. But I would go back to books that I hadn't read in 20 or 30 years, and that was wonderful because it felt like an opportunity rather than a sentence or, you know, a jailhouse sort of thing. And from that, I was able to move into new stuff. And I came up with a lot of wonderful sort of favorite books. There's this woman named Margot Livesey. I don't know if you know about her. She did this book called The Boy in the Field. You know, while we're you know, log rolling here. But 2 other books that I found wonderful that everybody should go out and buy instead of mine. One is Betsy Colbert's new book about climate change, which is called Under a White Sky. And Betsy won a Pulitzer for a book called Sixth Extinction, which people say is very bleak. But Betsy says when she comes over to my house, she feels like an optimist. So I recommend Betsy's book. And I also recommend Joanne Beard's collection of essays, which is called Festival Days. And it's a gorgeous, gorgeous book about any number of things. But one thing she writes very beautifully about is female friendships. She's wonderful on female friendships and sisters as well. So those are, you heard it here first, folks. If you buy one of those books and you don't like them, I'll give you your full money back. I promise.
That's a very generous offer. Yeah, I began the pandemic reading Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light. And for several hundred pages, I was convinced the pandemic would be over before the book had an endless quality that I really appreciated. And by the time Cromwell died, which I had known he was going to do.
You saw that coming, yeah.
I did see it coming. I was ready to sail into other books. And in terms of writing, my response to the pandemic was to begin writing a short novel. I hope it's a short novel set in Scotland, because I thought I'm not going to be able to get on a plane anytime soon.
Oh,
But if I write about it, I can visit every day.
that's
So
lovely.
that may be the only lovely thing about it. So
And now you will get to visit.
Exactly. I'm extremely happy.
In literature, we call that a happy ending.
We do.
Well, we have one more question, maybe. It looks like we have another one somewhere.
Do we have one more question? I think I asked the various questions.
Okay, so I invented that.
That came in. I think I've done such a good job of questioning you. Can I just go back to something you said earlier and ask one question about the Andromeda strain?
Yes, you may.
I'm unable to pronounce. Is that a novel set in America, or does it happen globally? And
it's a novel set in America. It was made into a pretty successful science fiction movie at the beginning of the 70s. Crichton was very big then. He did a Coma. He did Andromeda Strain. This was before Jurassic Park.
Right.
And the idea is that something comes from outer space. There are probes that are probing the upper atmosphere that bring back this pathogen that nobody can identify because nobody's ever seen it before. And one of the ways in which that clearly inspired Phase 6 is one of the ways in which is very different from COVID. Is I was interested in the dramatic possibilities of an entire global medical community being unable to figure out at first what this is. Mm-hmm. That seemed to me a kind of a wonderfully dramatic idea. And again, I posed this problem for my microbiologist, and I said, if you wanted to design a pathogen that would be very hard to pin down, what would you design? And that was a lot of fun because she was able to just go crazy, essentially. And I've often benefited from turning my aesthetic problems over to experts and saying, you solve this. How would you solve this, essentially? And that's what we ended up doing, was designing something. And there, there were a lot of precedents that we can think of for that sort of thing, like Legionnaire's disease. For many years, nobody knew exactly what was going on with that. What I was interested in was not something where we go, okay, we know what kind of virus this is. How do we deal with it? It was like, what on earth are we even dealing with? What is this, right? And that seemed to me, to go back to my 10-year-old self, a cool idea.
Yeah. It's a very cool idea. and of course, we should read all the books Jim recommends, but you should just stop everything and read Phase 6. And I think you should probably read it more than once if you can, because it opens up in new ways when you read it for a second time and are less in the grip of thinking, oh, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And I could appreciate some of the wonderful things you did when I was not desperately anxious about every minute of the time.
Well, and as many of your comments would suggest, it also makes a wonderful Christmas gift. So not only should everyone read it right away, but they should give it out to all of their relatives as well.
We agree. Books and Books definitely agrees with that.
There you go.
What a wonderful conversation. I'm sorry that you had an echo in your ear. Really sorry about that, but you seem to have plowed right through. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina.
It's been wonderful, a lovely evening. Really enjoyed hearing from both of you. What a great sense of humor you both have also. Thank you so much. And I just want to remind everyone that you can order the book. Just press the green button. We'll ship it right out to you. If you're in Miami, Margot Livesey as well. If you're in Miami and beautiful, and you want to come by one of our stores, we have it there as well. Congratulations on a great novel. Congratulations. And it's been wonderful to see you. And Margot, thank you for staying up so late.
Thank you, Margot.
To be with us tonight.
Thank you.
Truly a privilege and an honor.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.